Many of us, until a few weeks ago, we never heard of Ish Boshet. Had no idea that he was actually the second king of Israel, the son of King Saul, the one surviving son, where the other three sons, Yonatan and his brothers, died in the battle with the Philistines. We've been learning a lot about his kingdom and how David was the king over one single tribe, the tribe of Yehuda, Judah, while Ishboshet was still the king over 11 tribes, supported and sustained by Abner, his chief of staff, whom we just learned the last two classes, was killed by, actually assassinated by Yoav, David's chief of staff, and David knew nothing about it. Let's go into the text and let's see what we're talking about. Again, thanks for being here. Wonderful, wonderful turnout. Let's just put this here. Okay. And let's move this here. Here we go. We concluded last time with the final two psukim, verses of chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, Shmuel Bet. Vayomer HaMelech elav Adav, halo tedeu ki sar v'gadol nafal hayom hazeh Yisrael. David made clear to everybody when he learned that Yoav had assassinated Avner, made it clear to everyone. Avner was a man of greatness. He was righteous. He was great. I had nothing to do with this. I didn't know anything about it. It's an absolute violation of the most holy of things. And he says, this man was a prince, a great man in Israel. Sar v'gadol. And the word gadol does not just mean politically great, but religiously great. He was a righteous man, Avner. And so that's how it begins. Now, va'anochi hayom rach u'mashuach melech. And he goes on to say that truly, on this day, I am a weak person, even though I have been anointed to be king of Israel by the prophet Samuel, Shmuel Hanavi, long ago. But I'm weak. I'm the great King David. He doesn't use the words, I'm the great King David. I'm saying that. What he's saying essentially is, everyone's saying I'm the great King David. I am Rach. I am actually very weak. And truth to tell, these sons of Tzeruiah, Yoav and his brother, they're stronger and tougher than I am. And actually, a few weeks ago, Janet even asked me about it in class. How could that be? And it just happens to be that he needed Yoav, a mighty fighter, a mighty chief of staff, to be there for his army. But truly, he couldn't stand up to Yoav. He knew he had a problem. Sometimes this happens. David was not an experienced king. He had not yet risen to be king. And so here he was, suddenly the king of Israel, and he's realizing that I need this guy. I need this guy Yoav to fight the Philistines. And I don't know what to do. I'm stuck with him. And this happens. I'll tell you something. It's almost crazy. In real life, Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, named a guy, just so happens his name is Yoav Gallant, and he named a defense minister. And the idea was, he'll be the defense minister, but he answers to me. I'm the prime minister. And about a year ago, before the horrible things of Shabbat Shmini Atzeret, October 7th, with Hamas, Israel was embroiled in a different political uprising. There was an effort to try to make the Israeli Supreme Court more honest and more balanced. It's an extremely left-wing court based on rules that go back like 50 years, that the Supreme Court justices choose who the new ones are. When one retires, like in America, when one retires, the president, Democrat, Republican, it could be Obama, it could be Trump, whoever, it could be Biden, gets to name the new Supreme Court judge. Imagine if you had 9 Supreme Court justices who are all leftist or all right-wing, and when one of them retires, the other 8 leftists or the other 8 right-wingers get to appoint the new one. So it creates a fixed system. It never could change. So there was an effort to change the Supreme Court, and it set off a ruckus because the left didn't want that. And there were street demonstrations, tens of thousands who had other motivations. It wasn't only the court. They wanted to bring down Netanyahu. It's Israeli politics. And Yoav Gallant, his defense minister, said, I agree with the people demonstrating in the street. So Netanyahu decided, I don't need this. He's my defense minister. I picked him. Yeah, you're fired. And he fired Gallant. And the riots, the demonstrations doubled in the streets because now they had a target they could point to. Suddenly they made all these left-wingers made the right-wing Gallant the hero. We want Gallant, who they hate, but it would be able to be against Netanyahu. And when Netanyahu saw what that set off, he took Gallant back. He didn't want him. He doesn't like him, but he took him back. What can I do? All I am is the prime minister. This guy could take down my government. And even now, there have been one or two recent things where Netanyahu says, here's the plan at Gaza, and here's the plan when we're done in Gaza with the war. And Gallant holds a press conference next day, says, no, it's not going to be that way. I don't agree with him. This doesn't go on in any normal democracy. Well, it definitely does not go on in a dictatorship, because if you come out against Putin, then you have an airplane accident. But if you come out against a democratic, the guy who appointed you, you get fired. In fact, usually you just resign in protest. So that's an example in the modern times that we're living now, that Netanyahu, as strong as he is as the prime minister, he can't govern without keeping this guy as his defense minister. He's stuck with him. And it's almost a laughable irony that that corrupt International Criminal Court, which is kind of a fair name because it's a court of criminals, that they want to go ahead and they want to indict, that the head wants to indict two Israelis, Netanyahu and Gallant. And there's something almost humorous in the fact that Gallant hates Netanyahu, Netanyahu hates Gallant, and it's sort of God's will that the two of them are stuck with each other. And that was David's problem. Melech David, King David, is stuck with his Yoav. And that's why he couldn't do anything. And we go into chapter 4, building off what we just learned right now. Here we go. So we're in chapter 4. Vayishma ben Shaul, ki met Avner bechevron, v'rapu yadav v'chol Yisrael nivhalu. Wow. The Ish Boshet, but the text does not call him Ish Boshet. You notice how in the translation they put Ish Boshet in brackets. The text calls him son of Saul. The commentators talk about, why don't they call him Ish Boshet? They always called him Ish Boshet. It says that the son of Saul heard that Avner died in Hebron, and he became very weak, trembling. Indeed, all of Israel was trembling. So the rabbis ask, first of all, why doesn't it say Ish Boshet? And they say that once Avner died, Ish Boshet was no longer Ish Boshet. He was finished. He was practically made anonymous. He's sitting in a palace. He hasn't officially been dislodged from his monarchy, but effectively, he's no longer anything. He's simply there by virtue of being the son of King Saul. And soon he'll be out. But he's fearful. He knew that Avner went over to David. He knew that he gave Michal, David's wife, back to David. He knew his time as a king was pretty much over, and he accepted it. But this put a new fear in him, also for a second reason. The commentators talk about it, and they say that part of what went on here is what Abarbanel says. Abarbanel says on this pasuk that V'hinei nivhalu kol Yisrael. Not only was Ish Boshet, the son of Saul, terrified, all Israel was alarmed, more than alarmed, terrified. There was more than that. Why was everybody terrified? And there's a reason. They're all terrified because Ki mehem amru should David sivala horgo. There remained suspicion in the tribe of Binyamin, whereas most of Israel came to absolutely believe that David had nothing to do with the assassination of Abner. And they saw David fasted. He wouldn't eat. He was crying. He followed the funeral bier. Everybody saw. But in the tribe of Benjamin, they still had some doubts. For understandable reasons, they stood to lose the monarchy. And they were losing their chief of staff. Abarbanel says, Mehem Amru David Tzivala Hargo, there were people in the tribe of Benjamin who suspected, I don't know, maybe David was involved in this. And why would they suspect it? Acharei Shalo Haragad Yoav Avishai. Because David, when someone had killed King Saul, the Amalekite King Saul killed King Saul in the Philistine battle. Remember, Saul was dying. He'd been stabbed with a sword or spear, and he was dying, and he asked his second in command to kill him and finish his pain, but the second in command would not take the life of the anointed of God. And then that Amalekite fellow came by and he killed Saul, and then went to David and boasted, you'll be happy to know I killed your opponent. I killed Saul. And he was happy and he was smiling and he was boasting. And David said, how dare you? You slew the anointed of God. And David had him, the Amalekite, executed. Well, people remembered that. And they're wondering if this was against David's orders. And he's a king. He's not a prime minister in modern Israel that works based on modern democratic rules of the state and the Constitution and the Knesset. He was the king. And you know, from my Thursday night classes, the king can have anybody executed. Doesn't even need a reason. We've learned that in Rambam's Hilchot Malachim, which is based on Talmud. And people wondered if Yoav really acted on his own, why didn't David have him executed? Lama asaken Kivar Avner acharav. And they were wondering about it. And so there were others who said, I don't know, I think he was legit. I think David honestly had nothing to do with it. Umehem hayu omrim sheDavid haya nakichapayim uvar levav. So they weren't sure. They didn't know, is David, what they didn't know. V'huksha imken lama lo harag et harotzchim. And v'lachen nivhalu kulam ka'anashim she'enam yodim ha'emet. Therefore, everybody in Binyamin was scared, alarmed, terrified, because they just didn't know the facts. It's like what's going on right now with the death of that butcher of Tehran, the president of Iran, who was maybe next in line to be the next guy to run the show. And he just died in a helicopter crash. And there's a lot of questions. Why did he die? Iran's official statement now is that he died because he was in an American-made helicopter, and Trump had imposed sanctions. And even though Biden reversed most of the sanctions, one of the Trump sanctions is that America would not send military spare parts to Iran. And Biden never got around to reversing that sanction. And Iran now says the guy died because the helicopter was an older helicopter, and they couldn't get American-made spare parts because of Trump's sanction. And then there were other people who wondered, was Israel behind it? Were there other people in Iran who were behind it? And there's great discomfort and amid uncertainty. So Avner is dead. There's great uncertainty. Ushnei anashim saregadudim hayo ben Shaul. Meanwhile, they still had battalions. Avner was in charge of everything, but what's he in charge of? He wasn't a one-man army. He had battalions under him as the house of Saul. And two of them were headed by a guy named Ba'ana and another one named Rechav. Ba'ana and Rechav. And so these two were from the house of Benjamin, and they were heads of two of the battalions. And they actually at one point had fled from the tribal territory of Benjamin to the Philistine city of Gat. That's a city where Goliath came from, Goliath ben Gat. And they were in Gat. And they were there until what's going to happen right now. And so the rabbis comment on that. What was that all about? So tells us that, let's find the one I prepared for you. That was, let's get that one. And then there was this one. Okay, next. Here we go. So, all right, I'll tell you instead of reading it. So what happened was, there was a question as to what these guys were up to. There was something about their leadership of those two battalions that there was an uncertainty about them. And especially, on the other hand, after Saul was killed during the battle with the Philistines, they feared that the Philistines might come after them because they were heads of two of Saul's battalions. So they fled. And now we're told they came back, and we're going to find out what that's about. But first, verse 4. We're told another piece of this unfolding mini story. Yehonatan ben Shaul ben Nechei Raglayim, Jonathan, the son of Saul, the lifelong friend of David, that was that great love of David and Yonatan. They swore to each other they would be friends for life and would care for each other's families after, if one of them died before the other, the survivor would watch out for and care for the other one's family. And Jonathan, of course, Yonatan died in battle with his father against the Philistines. He left behind a son, a Nekei Raglayim, a son who was crippled for life, unable to walk, crippled legs, not just lame, certainly lame, but like an extra crippling of the legs. Ben Chamesh Shanim Haya, that boy was 5 years old at the time of the terrible war with the Philistines, when word came back from the Philistine camp that the Israelites lost and that King Saul had been killed with his sons, 3 of his 4 sons, including Jonathan. So Ben Chamesh Shanim Haya bevo Shmuel Shaul v'Yonatan miYisrael. So you'll remember that the battle took place in Jezreel. You remember in the area that was part of the land of the house of Benjamin, whereas David had only one tribe. Remember, Jezreel is up north. It runs from Mount Carmel to the Jordan River. And it's known as Emek Yisrael, the valley of Jezreel, even though, and we've said this in the past, even though Yisrael sounds similar to Yisrael, it's a different word with a different source. It means Yizra, that it's a place that was so fruitful, so much grass, that like Zerah, Yizra will be planted. It was seeded by God Almighty, like specially blessed with green and just a wonderful, wonderful place, the valley of Jezreel. But unfortunately, it also was where the war with the Philistines took place that culminated with, tragically, the death of Saul and Jonathan and the other 2 brothers. So back to our text. So Yonatan had that 5-year-old boy, and when the word came back that Saul and Jonathan had been killed in Jezreel, that 5-year-old boy had a caregiver, a nanny. He was perfectly fine. He was not crippled or lame at the time. She was his nanny. Batisa Ehu Omanto Vatanos. And when the word came back that this little 5-year-old boy's father, Jonathan, had been killed by the Philistines, and his grandfather Saul had been killed by the Philistines, and the Philistines had routed the Jews and were perhaps going to continue their route and perhaps even come into the land of the Benjaminites and God knows what, she fled desperately vayehi b'chavza, and after she was just running with abandon, almost not even looking. She was so, her heart was like beating through her chest, terrified that she's going to get killed, the baby's going to get killed. So, Vayehi b'chav zalanus, as she was running with abandon, vayipol vayipasech, she fell in a way like on top of his two little 5-year-old legs and crushed his bones. Now, if whether today's medicine and orthopedic surgeons could have done something about it, in that world, there was nothing that could bring his legs back to work. And so she inadvertently crippled him for life. Ushmo Mephivoshet. His name was Mephivoshet. You know, we've already heard that his uncle was Ish Boshet. And the word Boshet means ashamed. And there's one opinion that he was called Mephivoshet because he grew up to be a great, great Torah scholar and put anyone else to shame with his knowledge. But we're being told right now, like parenthetically, on the one hand, Avner is dead, that the people in Benjamin are terrified. They can't figure out, was David in on the killing or was he opposed to it? You have these two guys, Ba'ana and Rechav, who had gone into the land of the Philistines to find shelter for a while. And Jonathan had a son named Mephivoshet. So we've got four balls struggling here, and we've got to assume it's all going to come together, and it is. Pasuk Hey, verse 5. Vayalchu b'nei Rimon habe'erati Rechav v'Ana. Now those two heads of battalions who had taken shelter in Gat, in the land of the Philistines, came back from where they were taking sanctuary, and they came back to the land of the Benjaminite, the tribe of Benjamin, and they came to the palace. Vayavo kechom hayom. And they came during the heat of the day, midday, figure 12 noon, 1 o'clock. Now, they were experienced, they were heads of battalions, so they knew King Ish Boshet's lifestyle. They knew his thing. And they knew that part of his thing, and this was very, very common among kings in those days, probably some kings today too, that they would take a midday nap. Just as Mexico, they take a siesta. And when I lived in Israel for 2 years, you know, they on the weekdays, I don't know if they still do it because it was about 30, 40 years ago. But when I was there, all the stores closed from 1 to 4 p.m. The way it worked in Israel, maybe it's still that way. But when I was there, all stores were open 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. for 5 hours, closed 1 to 4, and then reopened 4 to 7 p.m., 3 hours, for a total of 8 hours. But instead of 9 to 5, like in America, it was 1 to 4. And I asked, like, what's the deal with the 1 to 4? And it was explained to me, two things. A lot of them take off 1 to 4 so they could go shopping. So I'm an American, and I learned the Talmud. I remember asking, what's the point taking off 1 to 4 to go shopping if everybody else is closing their store 1 to 4? Nobody ever had an answer for that. And the other thing I was told is that they take a siesta. It gets hot in Tel Aviv and places. It gets really, really hot. And people don't want to shop between 1 and 4 because it's awfully hot. And air conditioning, even then, was very, very expensive. And it just made sense. Take off the hottest hours of the day and just sleep through. Again, no air conditioning. So for a king, Israel, other kings, in a time that there was no air conditioning, it actually made sense. They would take a nap from 1 to 4. Now, Ba'ana and Rechav knew this, that was his practice. Okay, so we continue. Vayalchu b'nei Rimon habe'eroti Rechav v'Ba'ana, the two of them, vayavo kechom hayom, they came at the heat of the day, el Beit Ish Boshet. They came to the home, the palace of Ish Boshet. Here he's named the king of the Benjaminites. V'hu shochev et mishkav atzaharayim, and he's taking his midday siesta nap. V'hina, Ba'u atoch habayit lokchei chitim. And the two of these guys, Rachav and Ba'ana, walked into the palace together with a large entourage of business people who were involved in selling wheat. And they were there in the palace to discuss business, whether to discuss with the king or to discuss with the commerce secretary or whatever they had in those days who would make those kinds of decisions. And they kind of mixed themselves, Rechav and Ba'ana, kind of blended themselves in with the people there to sell wheat. And they tiptoed to the bedroom of the king, because they knew the layout of the palace. They knew exactly where the king's room was. Again, they were heads of battalions. Vayakuhu ela Chomesh. And they slaughtered him. They assassinated him. By the way, Chomesh, you may recall, is that same location that Avner unfortunately had killed Asael, the brother of Yoav. And it was the same location that Yoav had killed Avner. That's the fifth rib, where apparently the liver, that means they got the liver and other parts, vital parts of the body. So they slaughtered him. They slew him to get him exactly where they wanted, not the belly. That's the wrong translation, but Chomesh from the word Chamesh, 5, the fifth rib. And then they fled. They knew if they stayed around, they'd be arrested and maybe executed. And so instead of staying around and getting in trouble, they assassinated King Ish Boshet. It's a horrible, horrible story in Jewish history. And as I said, it's amazing. Most of us don't even know this ever happened. Now we do. And Vayavau habayit, V'ushochev amitato b'chadar mishkavo. Continuing with what they did, as they went into his house, some say it's continuing, and they went into his house. Some say it's saying, and he went into the room. Some say they stepped out of the room, made sure no one's around, then he went back in the room. V'ushochev amitato b'chadar mishkavo. And Ish Boshet the king was lying asleep in his bed. Again, vayaku vayimitu. They slew him, they killed him. Vayasiru et rosho. We find this a lot in biblical times, the cutting off of a head. What's that all about? Is it about brutality and cruelty? Well, it certainly is brutal and cruel. But when we apply the things we do in modern times, nowadays we have fingerprints, even have DNA. If you want to prove somebody's dead or something like that, you could take a photograph. We have cameras. You can have it on your phone. You can take a photograph of the deceased, get his fingerprints, get his DNA, depending on how much you want to prove to someone that he's dead. In those days, they didn't have that. And so it was actually not like a ISIS, bin Laden kind of modern day Muslim terrorism thing, but it was the way that people would, if they needed to get the proof to a greater public that someone was dead, perhaps to put people out of fear, that's what they would do. I remember a few years ago, do you remember that Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, the Colonel Gaddafi from Libya, he was a terrorist of the worst sort to his own people too, not only to the West, not only to Jews and to Americans. He shot down an American civil aircraft, but he was a murderer. And everybody in Libya was terrified of him because you took one wrong step, he'd have you executed. And he was known not to be rational. He's crazy. They used to call him, not as a joke even, Daffy Gaddafi. And they were just, it was crazy. So you may recall, there was a uprising against him. People even crazier and more radical than he overthrew him. You may remember, some of you, about, I guess Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State at the time. That was the time of that whole thing where the American ambassador to Libya was killed, in the embassy, if you remember back then. So the word got out, Gaddafi is dead. And now, if Gaddafi really is dead, the people in Libya want to dance. They haven't yet come to learn who has replaced him. It's going to be even worse. Where they're coming from right then is, we'd like to celebrate. There's only one problem. What if he's not dead? What if it's a trick by him to smoke out those who hate him? We'll go and start dancing in the streets, and one by one we'll get picked off by Gaddafi. So people didn't know what to do. They hoped it was true. Also, Libya is not like here. We have live television, and I mean, you've got more than states censored television. Who knows if you even have television? I mean, it's like a they're still in the 1400s. That's the advanced people there. And so what they killed Gaddafi, I don't know if you remember this. They took his body and they brought him to a butcher shop. You know how every butcher store has a freezer butcher is selling meat. He can't be sure he's going to sell all his meat supply in one day. So what does he do with them? You can't leave your meat out. So every butcher store has a big, big freezer where they keep their meat. So if they haven't sold, they keep their meat. They brought Gaddafi into a butcher store freezer, and they crucified him. They hammered him into the wall. His arms and they hammered him into the wall. So, and then they invited people to come and look and see for yourself that Gaddafi really is dead. And there was a line like the first Harry Potter movie, it went for 3 miles of people online just to see Gaddafi is dead. And then they knew it was safe to celebrate until the new guys made themselves known, and then people saw one is just as bad as the other. So that's why they cut off his head. They cut off Ish Boshet's head. They had a reason. Obviously, not for people to celebrate, because really nobody disliked him. He was a very nice, likable guy. He just was not a strong king, and it was not his destiny to be the king. The destiny was that David would be the king. So, Vayakehu, Vayakuhu, Vayimituhu, Vayasiru et Rosho. They cut off his head. And what are they going to do with his head? Vayachu et Rosho, Vayelchu derech Arava kol halayla. They took the two of them, Ba'ana and Rechav. They took his head, and they walked all night through the Arava. That's like where that's east of the Jordan River. That's like where modern day Jordan is. In those days, it was like where Moab and Edom and you go, verse 8, Pasuk Het, Vayaviu et Rosh Ish Boshet el David Hebron. And they come and they deliver the head of Ish Boshet to David in his capital of Hebron. So let's again get an idea of what this was all about here. So they kill him, they kill Ish Boshet in the land of Benjamin, the southernmost part of the 11 tribes over which Ish Boshet was monarch. Then they go through the Arava, the other side of the Jordan River, to the east bank, the land it's Gilad, and they work their way around and back to Hebron. Hebron, you will recall, is the very center of the area that King David was ruling, the one tribal territory over which he initially was king, the tribal of Judah, and that was his capital. So they come to Hebron, and you'll remember he had Avner buried in Hebron. After the assassination of Avner, David gave orders that Avner be given a most honorable state burial and funeral procession in the most important cemetery under his reign, the Hebron Cemetery. Like in the United States, it would be Arlington National Cemetery. In Israel, it would be Har Herzl, Mount Herzl. So that's where David had him buried, you remember, in Hebron, in his capital city. And now they came, and they go all night long by a view at Rosh Ish Boshet el David Hebron, and they bring the head of Ish Boshet. This is going to prove he really is dead. Not that we're saying so. They bring to David in Hebron, Vayomru LaMelech, and they said to King David, Hine Rosh Ish Boshet ben Shaul Oyivcha. Behold, this is the head of Ish Boshet, the son of Saul, your enemy. Asher bikesh et nafshecha. Saul, you remember, is your enemy who sought your life. He tried to kill you. Well, this is the son of the guy who tried to kill you. Va'itein Hashem ladoni hamelech, and God, seeing how Saul repeatedly tried to catch you and to kill you, God continually protected my Lord the king. Va'itein Hashem ladoni hamelech nikamod hayom hazeh, and the Lord has given our Lord King David great vengeance today, on this day. Your troubles are all over. There's no one left to be a threat to you. You have your vengeance. Mishaul umizaro. You have no one from the house, from Saul, who can ever hurt you, not his brothers, nobody. And if you might be thinking to yourself, well, actually, there is one remaining person. We just learned about Mephivoshet, who had been 5 years old when he was crippled, when the nanny was running with him. That's why they put that pasuk, that verse, as an aside, a parenthetical in the middle of the story, the narrative, to let you know that when those two guys, Ba'acha and Rechav, went into the palace for the purpose of killing Ish Boshet and getting a reward from David, they're going to go to David and they're going to expect a reward, and at least to get appointed heads of battalions. So if you're wondering if their whole purpose was to let David know there's no more threat from the house of Saul, well, why didn't they kill Mephivoshet? Because they made a calculated decision. He's not a threat to anybody. He can't even stand up. Now, it's interesting, in our own lifetime, there happens to be one very powerful, I'm not saying he's good or bad, we each have our own opinions, I have mine. There is one very powerful governor in the United States who is, quote unquote, a cripple, Greg Abbott of Texas. He's one of the strongest governors in the United States. And people who don't really necessarily know it and just read about him, like the way you read about Ron DeSantis or I don't know, Gavin Newsom, you wouldn't know it. The guy can't stand. He's always in a wheelchair. Like Franklin Roosevelt at the end of his presidency. He was in a wheelchair. He hid it from the public. The media agreed not to show pictures of him in a wheelchair. And he had people who were assigned 1 or 2 times when he had to speak in a public thing. There was a way to prop him up. They actually tied him to be propped up. And people didn't know it. They heard about it only after his lifetime. Even when they built a statue of him, the Roosevelt Foundation Trust did not want a statue to be of him in a wheelchair. So Ba'ana and Rechav knew that Mephivoshet is no threat, no need to kill him. And now they come back and they say, you have no more problems. That's the end of the house of Saul. God has given you complete vengeance against your enemies, and that's it. Verse 9. Now you can almost guess what's going to happen next. I'll even pause 10 seconds so you can mull in your mind what's going to happen next. David responds to Rechav and Ba'ana as follows. Vayomer lehem, he says to them, Chai Hashem, you may recall, that is the way that someone takes an oath, a divine oath, not just swearing randomly, but invoking the holy name, not literally the 4-letter holy name, but invoking God's name as an oath. Chai Hashem, as God lives, Asher pada'at nafshi mikol tzara, the God who has redeemed me, protected me from every danger and sorrow and travail. And I've been through so much. I've had to hide among the Philistines. I've had to hide among the Moabites. I've had to hide everywhere. And my life has been in danger, and there have been wars, and I had Saul, and God who has protected me from everything. I invoke him in this oath. Ki hamagid li lemor. I call your memory, he says, I call your memory back as I'm invoking God to something in the past. There was a man who came to me and said, Hine made Shaul. Behold, David, Saul, King Saul now is dead. V'hu haya kimavasir be'inav. And he who came to me, that Amalekite, who had finished him off, came to me proudly and boastfully and happy, thinking he's bearing me the best of good tidings. Saul is dead, and I personally killed him. Do you remember what I did? I had him seized, and I had him executed in Siklag. Where's Siklag? Siklag is over here. It was part of the Philistine area where David was hiding it for a point. You may remember, he was in Gath, and then to stay far enough away from the king of the Philistines, he stayed on the other side. The king went to battle, didn't know what he was up to, but that's where he was at that time. He had not yet moved to Hebron. When he got the word from the guy who came all the way to tell him, I killed off Saul, he had the Amalekite killed right away. In the name of God, he says, Afki anashim rasha'im, hargu et ish tzadik beveito mishkavo. As bad as what that guy did, now I've got here two men who are the epitome of evil, sinful evil of the worst sort, who murdered, and ish tzadik, a tzaddik, a righteous man. David understood that for political reasons, circumstances, Ish Boshet was on the other side. But David did not harbor any personal animus towards Ish Boshet. He regarded him to be a tzaddik, a righteous man. And for that matter, Ish Boshet did not harbor any hostility against David. We've been learning so carefully, verse after verse, pasuk by pasuk. At no point does Ish Boshet ever comment negatively about David. And he acceded to giving back David's wife, Michal, and he knew that Avner was turning, and he accepted it, that his time is up. He was a righteous man. David says in this oath, in light of what I did to that Amalekite who finished off Saul, now I have two really, really evil people. At least what you could say for the Amalekite is that Saul was dying basically anyway. And he saw Saul was in pain and suffering, and Saul begged him to finish him off. So I still executed him, partly because he's an Amalekite, but because he had the temerity to think he would get a reward and celebrated killing the king of Israel, the anointed of God. But he's nothing like what these two guys are, who attacked and murdered a completely innocent, righteous person. There was no need for it. Beveito mishkavo, and killed him in his bed while he was sleeping. The Amalekite, at least, was in the middle of a battlefield. Saul was already getting killed. Here, it was peacetime. Va'ata with an ayin. So now, halo avakeshet amomi etchem. I am going, I take an oath that I'm going to seek his blood, Ish Boshet's blood from you. I'm going to seek recompense and true vengeance on his behalf from you. Uvi'arti etchem min haaretz, I shall eradicate you from the face of this earth. You're that evil. By Itzav David et Hana'arim, and so David gave a command and order to the men who served for him, like his bodyguards and his internal guards and soldiers, by a hargum, and they killed the two of them, Ba'ana and Rechav, by a katzatsu et yedehem v'et raglehem, and they cut off their hands and their feet. By etlu al habrecha bechevron, and what was left of them, they hanged in the at the swimming pool, or the massive pool in the capital city of Hebron. And what about the head of Ish Boshet? That Rosh Ish Boshet lo kachu, and the head of Ish Boshet was taken by Baru bekever Avner bechevron, and he was given a royal state burial, like again at that Arlington Cemetery or Har Herzl. He was buried in the burial site where Avner was buried, in the most holy cemetery under King David in Hebron. Now, we have some other things we want to look at quickly while we still have some time. So I've prepared some additional commentators that I really want to bring to you. First of all, Malbim talks about why it was that Ish Boshet was not killed. So part of it is Siper Haroshem Shna'asa b'mitat Avner Shalon Yishar Od Ish Yitchazek b'malchut Shaul. It was clear no one else after Ish Boshet would be capable of holding on to the throne of Saul. Again, Radak says, "Near eki acher shehikuhu v'yatzu lahem chazru labayit lahasirat rosho lahavio leDavid." The killers went back into the room where, after they killed Ish Boshet, it was like, on second thought, let's go back and cut off his head. Ki chashvu limtso chen be'enei David b'zeh hadavar, because they anticipated being rewarded and gaining great favor with David because of this. Now, what's the deal? And for this, we have the commentary of the Malbim on Pasuk Yud Bet, verse 12. What's the deal with the cutting of the hands and the feet? By a katzutsuya et yudeim, why did David have Ba'anaz and Rechav's hands cut off after their execution? By a katzutsu et yudeim sha'asu hama'aseh, because their hands killed Ish Boshet and cut off his head. They sinned with their hands, and so he had their hands cut off. Their evil hands, the et raglehem sheholchu levaseret David, and he cut off their feet because they had walked so great a distance all night long, had trekked from the house of Saul, where they assassinated Ish Boshet, through the Arava, across the eastern side of the Jordan, through the whole area, coming back in to get by daybreak or morning to David and Hebron, because they sinned with so much eagerness with their feet as well as their hands. He cut off their feet by Etlu. And why did he have the rest of them hanged? And by the way, when we talk about hanging human beings in past tense, we use the word hanged. Clothing gets hung, and people who are executed get hanged. By Etlu, why did he have them hanged? Kedei shelo yazid od ish l'shloch yad b'melech. He wanted to make very clear for the entire nation. Again, they didn't have news in those days the same way. They didn't have the 11 p.m. news or the 6 p.m. news or cameras, newspaper reporters. And hanging played a very important part in conveying a message in cases of someone who had sinned horribly. You didn't just hang political opponents, but if someone did something that is so evil that you just can't speak about it, such as killing a righteous man, a king of Israel, he wanted everyone to see that's what the King David monarchy is going to be like. No one's going around killing people whom you think are my enemies, and certainly not a king. V'zeh asa midin melech, v'lo midin haTorah. Interesting. We have learned on Thursday nights, as part of our class on Jewish ethics and values in wartime against our enemies, learning the Gemara and Mishnah and the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, we've learned a great deal about the power and authority of the King of Israel in biblical times. Times in Gemara, times 2 when there's a Beit HaMikdash. When the Holy Temple stands, which it does not now, but in the future someday again will, in Messianic times, the king has extraordinary authority. And we've learned that one of those authorities is that the king can authorize anybody that he deems appropriate to be executed and hanged. And he doesn't have to cite a statute or a law or a code. If the king wants someone executed, the person could be executed. Now, as we also learned Thursday night, kings of Israel did not go about doing that willy-nilly. But Malbim is telling us, if you're wondering which of the 613 laws of the Torah was David following or administering when he ordered the execution and the cutting off of the hands and the feet of these two men, so Malbim is telling us there is no law or halacha that says that should be done. Rather, he was acting, again, asa midin melech. He did it by virtue of the all-encompassing rule that applies to kings, lo midin haTorah, and not based on any particular Torah law per se. And then finally, I prepared for you this abarbanel. Let's just the last abarbanel. Let's see what I have here. V'zachar sheDavid chara apo bir'oto hameri v'akesherahu. The text tells us that the text wants us to know not merely that David executed these guys, but chara apo, he was enraged with fury. He didn't just react upset or sort of mildly deciding in his mind, oh no, this will not do. This will not do. He was enraged in perceiving this act of rebellion and assassination. V'nishba b'Hashem shehu harag b'tziklag et anar haknani, and he took an oath in God's name, as we just learned, that he said to God, in Ziklag, at the time of the Philistine War, when Saul was killed, I gave the order to kill that young Canaanite Amalekite, Asher Amar Shaharag et Shaul, Liyoto Mevasir Beinav. I gave orders at that time that that guy be executed. That guy who came thinking he's bringing good news to me. Umidivrei David, Bazeh Shalo Harag Ha'amaleki et Shaul, V'shalo Hemito David Ki Im Lahagido Zek Mevasir Beinav. And our Barbanel says, as I said a few moments ago, that the reason David ultimately had that Amalekite killed, not so much that he finished off Saul because Saul was like 99% dead and he actually needed to be taken out of his misery, but because that Amalekite came thinking he's bringing good news and smiling. And we learned at the time, it was also part of God's unfolding of history that King Saul, who was punished by God for having spared the king of Amalek when he was ordered to execute that king, that Saul was trying to show mercy to the Amalekites, and as a result, his punishment was he was killed. The final death blow was by an Amalekite. And so, and David feeling that, oh my gosh, that he thought he's bringing me good news, he's going to get a reward? Are you kidding? As David said to that Amalekite then, how did you not fear to strike with your hands the anointed of God, the king of Israel? Yoresha Hanar Ha'amaleki Hemit Shaul. So in that case, that's why he had the Amalekite killed, the one who killed Saul. Avol Hamitaha he. But this killing, this assassination and murder, but unlike that one was Yoav bevakashat Shaul. That was at Saul's request. And Saul knew he had no way to live. He was not going to survive. But here, by contrast, near Es-Samech v'Nelaz, v'Masha Harag, et Shaul v'Lachen Harag. So there he was killed. The Amalekite was killed because he was rejoicing and he was happy. Here, all the more so, David said. And therefore, David had these guys killed. So as we finish class today, we're left with an interesting development as we've done all of chapter 4 in tonight's class. The house of Saul pretty much passes from Jewish history going forward. With Saul's death in the battlefield, the house of Saul remained and continued. Do you recall how long? 2.5 years. As we learned last week, one of the reasons Avner died, that God made it that Avner would die, is that he had delayed the rise of King David to the monarchy by 2.5 years by sustaining Ish Boshet in power. So Ish Boshet and the house of Saul continued centrally in Jewish history for 2.5 more years. After this, they kind of pass. The tribe of Benjamin continues in Jewish history and becomes a very unusual history unfolds for the Benjaminites. But on the other hand, Mordechai of the story of Purim, Mordechai was Ish Yamini, a Benjaminite. So Benjaminites have the honor of being the first king of Israel, and Benjaminites have the honor of being at the center of the story of Purim. On the other hand, in the last chapter of the book of Judges, Shoftim, which we learned a long time ago, Benjaminites had the great dishonor of having been involved in so terrible a sin that they almost were eradicated. It's the only time in history that any tribes, in that case all 11 others, attempted to eradicate one of the tribes of Israel, wiped them off the face of the earth. And you remember we learned that terrible period when we were ending the book of Shoftim, book of Judges. And so that's part of the reason that the first king of Israel was from the house of Benjamin. We had come so close, the other 11 tribes, to wiping out the house of Benjamin, the entire tribe, not just the house of Saul, that when God gave the order, we're not going to wipe out a tribe of Israel, but people still had this feeling about Benjamin. All right, we're not going to wipe them out, but they're no good. That's why God made the first king of Israel, specifically Dafka from the house of Benjamin, for the nation to see that I, God, am not just saying don't wipe them out, but they're 100% as good as all of you. They're so kosher that I'm making them the first king of Israel, even though the destiny is for the house of David. That was the prophecy of Yaakov Avinu, our father Jacob, on his deathbed, that the house of David, the house of Yehuda, that's where the kingship would come from, until Mashiach ben David. Nevertheless, that's why the house of Benjamin was given that first kingship. So we'll just give a little flavor without commentary, because we're kind of out of time now, just to get a little sense of the beginning of the next chapter, and then we'll take it from there. So David is king of Israel. There is no more house of Benjamin in the way. Avner tragically is dead. Yoav is his chief of staff, and there's no more competition. By Avohu kol Sheftei Yisrael el David Chevrona, all the tribes of Israel, the other 11 tribes, including Benjamin, and of course his own tribe, Judah, Yehuda, all assembled en masse to David in Hebron. By Yomer Limor, and as a nation of 12 tribes, they said, Hinenu atzmecha ubesorcha anachnu. Behold, we are your flesh and blood. Basar is from the word basar, flesh. Etzem is kind of bones, actually. But to put it into the Hebrew, that's the Hebrew equivalent of the English expression, we are your flesh and bones. So by popular acclaim, not by taking the kingship and the monarchy through an assassination or something like that, you're being welcomed by popular acclaim. Last pasuk for today, or Gam etmol gam shalshom, behiyot Shaul melech aleinu. Even long before, in the past, long ago, even while Saul was our king, Ata hayita hamotzi v'hamevi et Yisrael. You already had emerged as the one who brings victory against the Philistines and others to the Jewish people, as our human, God is our savior, but as the vehicle and person through whom God was bringing us salvation. You already had emerged that way. And God already had told you through the prophet Samuel, Shmuel Navi, that you will be the shepherd who shepherds my nation. But Israel, God said, you will be the leader of Israel. So therefore, by Israel, all the elders, not only the masses, having come from all over the country, like at a presidential inauguration, at the inauguration, they have a big national day of celebration for the new president, and people come from all over the country to Washington, D.C. In the same way, so the elders came, so everybody's come to Hebron, David, and they all, including the elders, entered into a covenant in the presence of God. And although David privately earlier had been anointed God's king by the prophet Samuel, Shmuel Navi, now he also was publicly anointed to be the king over Israel. And with that,